Welcome everybody to this UN General Assembly special session side event focused on anti-corruption. We are delighted to be here today co-sponsoring this event with the Department of State's Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. My name is Catherine Eleanor. I'm the Senior Global Legal Advisor for the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. And together with the CEELI Institute, we are very privileged to be implementing a number of regional and global projects supported by INL. And we'll be able to talk a little bit about those projects today. But in particular, we're here and very excited to launch a new tool that actually came directly out of that portfolio. So welcome to all of you. For those of you who don't know IFES, we have worked in around 145 countries for almost 35 years. And we work with partners in each of those countries to basically build democracies that can deliver for everybody. We've obviously learned a lot during 35 years, including how to protect the independence and accountability of those institutions that are charged with protecting democracy. So for IFES, corruption is a democracy problem. And when we say that, we don't mean that democracies suffer more from corruption or that there is a problem with the democratic model. Rather, what we mean is the more unjust or the more autocratic a country's governing structure is, the more serious corruption can flourish. And for us, this is particularly sobering, particularly post-COVID-19. Around a full 68% of the world's population now live in autocracies, and this represents around 87 countries according to VDEM. So we believe the answer to corruption is more and better democracy. So if serious corruption thrives on unjust systems of power, we must address those systems and not just the outcomes. So in particular, most countries, whether autocratic or not, use elections as some form of legitimacy for their government. And if you inject illicit funding and spending into elections and politics, then what you get as a result are illicit actors holding very tightly to the levers of power in a country. And that hold can be very difficult to break. So that's why IFES is delighted that the action-oriented political declaration that is emerging from the UNGA special session references electoral integrity for the first time, which we think addresses a gap in the UN Convention Against Corruption. And IFES was pleased to highlight this issue or this gap during the preparations for UNGASS and delighted to see the result. So that takes me to the topic of this side event, which is not a gap in UNCAC, but a key part of the convention, which was revolutionary when it was adopted. And that is the international peer review mechanism. This has now been incorporated into subsequent UN conventions, but also regional mechanisms such as Greco in Europe, MESIC in the Americas, and the African Union peer review mechanism. As I said, IFES and CEELI have had the privilege of implementing regional and global anti-corruption programs sponsored by INL, focused on helping countries implement these international and regional anti-corruption commitments. A key indicator of a country's project is intended to be these peer review reports. And indeed, these have actually formed the basis of analysis in each of the countries where IFES and CEELI has worked in partnership with local civil society and institutions. However, as part of those projects and our work, we've seen the limitations of these reports, and especially in how they might be interpreted or used. So does this suggest a failure of the peer review model? Despite the challenges that we've faced with our partners, none of us think so. Rather, there's a failure in the transition from peer review to implementation. So how can we better understand and action the findings in these peer review reports which take a lot of time and investment to undertake, but may otherwise remain on a shelf. So today we are very pleased to launch a labor of love under our INL program called Piercing the Veil, Using Peer Reports in the Fight Against Corruption, a guide from turning analysis into action. We're going to play just a short video to introduce the tool, and then I'm going to hand over to my partner institute, the CEELI Institute, and then the sponsor of this important work, the Bureau of INL.
States that sign on to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and commit to the standards of regional bodies such as the African Union or European Union are obligated to take action at the national level to prevent and apply penalties for corruption. To support state action, peer review mechanisms evaluate progress towards anti-corruption commitments. An immense amount of effort and expertise go into producing these evaluations, which generally result in a report on a country's progress with recommendations for improvement. However, the findings of these evaluations are often underutilized. There are several barriers to turning their analysis into action, from low public awareness about the review process and uncertainty around which recommendations should be prioritized, to the dense technical nature of the reports. This can make it challenging for a reader to extract lessons and implement solutions in practice. Piercing the Veil, a guide for transforming analysis into action, was designed for civil society, governments, institutions, international organizations, donors, and other stakeholders that are seeking to maximize the impact of peer review mechanisms. The Analysis to Action, or A2A guide, walks readers through a series of practical activities to help them understand the review processes, analyze review reports, amplify important messages, and set priorities, and ultimately realize anti-corruption commitments in practice. You can learn more and find a copy of the guide on IFES.org.
And one of the things I'm most excited about with this guide is that it has been authored by two individuals who have spent many years, if not decades, of experience with these peer review mechanisms. And shortly on this panel, we'll have a chance to talk about their experiences. But first, I would like to hand over to Christopher Lehman, who is the Executive Director of the CEELI Institute and our partner in this initiative. Chris.
Thanks so much, Katie. Good evening and good afternoon to everyone. I am talking to you from the CEELI Institute in Prague in the Czech Republic. Just a short word about us. We are in our 20th anniversary year here in Central Europe, focused on promotion of judicial independence, the rule of law, accountable and transparent governments, and human rights. And increasingly, as Katie had noted, the challenge of addressing corruption, not only in this region, but across the world, has become an increasingly larger part of our portfolio, and one where we are spearheading a number of different kinds of projects. Let me start by focusing on the core principle behind the guide. And it's such a sort of a simple thought, and yet it has so rarely been put into practice. The idea of taking all of this information, all of these peer review reports, and actually designing a foreign assistance or an international assistance project out of them focused on anti-corruption, with the exception, I would say, of possibly the financial action task force review processes, where I have seen a little more practical application. This was the first time I had been directly involved in a project where we built the project from the ground up off of a peer review report. And that was, unfortunately, we did not have this guide to instruct us in the process, but I think a lot of the methodology behind the guide came out of our trial and error that we applied. So the project was started in 2018. It's colloquially called the ECAC project. That stands for Effective Combat Against Corruption. The project, I think a lot of the credit behind this needs to actually go to the GPP office, the Global Programs Office at INL, which conceptualized this idea into a notice of funding opportunity. It was the INL staff that said, look, we are seeing all of these peer review reports, and they must be good for something, including us, conceptualizing a project designed around getting some of these recommendations actually implemented. INL offered us a fair amount of flexibility in putting the project design together, and as to both the specific peer review reports we would use and the countries we would focus on. So it quickly became apparent to us that the GRECO, the Council of Europe's group of states against corruption, the European anti-corruption body, which does frequent rounds of evaluation and assessments, would be a very useful tool to start. We focused initially also on Southeastern Europe, particularly Romania, Montenegro, and Bulgaria, for three reasons. First, we felt that working with countries with either within the European Union or in the accession process creates kind of an additional framework that would really push anti-corruption projects forward. Second, these are countries where there is a great deal of public awareness and support for anti-corruption initiatives. And third, because we had excellent civil society partners that we had identified, including the Expert Forum in Romania. Laura Stefan will be talking to you in a minute from that organization, the Bulgarian Institute of Legal Initiatives in Bulgaria, and the Center for Monitoring and Research in Montenegro. And it's really the 5 organizations together with CEELI and IFES that have spearheaded this. So what did we do? We actually started with what has now become activity 8 of the guidelines, which is we compiled a comprehensive digest of the relevant PRR findings. In other words, we took an Excel spreadsheet, graphed out the relevant GRECO findings, figured out which were accomplished, which were partially accomplished, and which weren't. And that gave us just a really useful overview. And then we really proceeded to what is now activity 11 of the guide, which is rate the options for feasibility and importance. And when we had that Excel spreadsheet in front of us, we could quickly see what had not yet been accomplished by the host, by the 3 countries. And that narrowed very much our frame of action. And within those remaining recommendations that were unfulfilled, unimplemented, we were able to identify the ones that we were going to prioritize for this program. And it's worked well. And I hope that our lessons are now kind of articulated, maybe better than I've done today, in this very useful guide that I think will be a wonderful tool for many partner organizations. We have since expanded the project with additional support from INL beyond the initial core group of countries in Europe. So we are now expanding this to Asia and Africa, obviously looking at additional peer review mechanisms besides GRECO and UNCAC, because we are in new regions. And so that's sort of a wrap up, but that's where we are, and we continue to move forward with this methodology. So thanks to all.
Thank you, Chris, very much for giving an overview of the project, and of course credit to INL, who I agree came up with this excellent idea, and we've certainly learned a lot of lessons, part of which we'll hear from Laura. But I would like to hand over to INL now, and I'm particularly pleased that we have with us Deputy Assistant Secretary Erin Barclay, who is a career member of the Senior Executive Service. And prior to the current position, she was Acting Assistant Secretary in the Department of State's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. But she's had many years of experience in the anti-corruption field. We're delighted to have her here today. We're delighted to have her support and INL's support for this portfolio and this tool. So please, Deputy Assistant Secretary.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks so much. And thank you to Chris for the great overview of the project. Let me just start by saying, first of all, I want to applaud IFES and the CEELI Institute and all the partners that Chris mentioned for the hard work that went into producing this. You know, I spent the first part of my career in civil society and looking at these peer review reports. And when Katie showed the video, it did remind me of how sometimes impenetrable those documents really were for us as activists and advocates outside trying to influence our governments. And so it's really thrilling to see something that's usable, accessible, and I really do hope for all of us as member states and all of us as civil society who are joining today and others have the chance to really use this and to find the usefulness of it. I thought what I would do is to just dial out a little bit to give a sense of sort of where this fits kind of in the broader US government policy approach to anti-corruption and to the multilateral system, and the usefulness of peer review mechanisms and the guide within that broader context. So I think if you joined this webinar, you probably all are of the same mind about the corrosive nature of corruption. So I probably don't have to go through the litany of ways that corruption undermines and corrodes democracy, as Katie laid out. President Biden has laid out a fairly ambitious anti-corruption agenda for us. And we in the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau at the State Department are fortunate to find ourselves somewhat in the middle of implementing this ambitious agenda. I want to read you from the President's interim national security guidance that was issued in March of 2021. What the White House has said specifically on this issue of corruption. It says, the US will take special aim at confronting corruption, which rots democracy from the inside and is increasingly weaponized by authoritarian states to undermine democratic institutions. So very much follows along with what Katie started us with at the outset. Let me just say a couple words about the UNGASS, the political declaration, the negotiations that have been going on, and sort of how we see this fitting all together. The declaration that is going to be adopted tomorrow really is a demonstration, I think, of the international community's commitment to advancing the fight against corruption. From the US side, we very much believe that that the roadmap for the fight against corruption already exists. We have the existing international anti-corruption architecture. As Katie said at the outset, what really is on the table for us, wherever we sit, inside or outside of the government, is what we do to reaffirm and uphold this architecture. And we believe that the political declaration that will be adopted tomorrow is going to help us move that ball forward. In that regard, this really requires member state countries fulfilling the existing obligations enshrined in the UNCAC, which Chris and Katie already mentioned. This is a treaty that enjoys almost near universal ratification. And that is a huge opportunity for us in the international community to hold ourselves and other member states accountable to our obligations there. The challenge for us is to make those obligations real and to see demonstrable action against them. We want to make sure, and the tool is one way we can do this, that the obligations enshrined in the UNCAC do not just remain words on a page, but in fact are implemented and improve people's lives on the ground where we all live. We are so in the vein of moving out on implementation, let's just talk about the guide for 1 second. As Katie and Chris mentioned, we've been lucky to partner with IFES and CEELI on this guide under the global and regional programs with IFES and the CEELI Institute. We in the State Department are committed to supporting states as we work to meet the standards and commitments laid out in the UNGASS, Greco, as has already been mentioned, and other international bodies. And you know, the U.S. is not exempt in this regard. We're a member of UNCAC, the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, the Anti-Bribery Convention, and we're a member of Greco. So we are subject to the peer review process ourselves in each one of these bodies. Now, we all know, wherever we are in the world, the hard reality that progress towards anti-corruption commitments can be reversed because of changing political dynamics and priorities. Katie talked at the top about elections. We all know those make a difference. We also know that adopting a robust anti-corruption legal framework is just the beginning. Meaningful implementation of anti-corruption laws and regulations is a very long process in and of itself. Recognizing that the peer review process and the recommendations that come out of it can be daunting, this guide is really meant to identify a country's most pressing anti-corruption issues and actionable steps that countries can take to address them. Taking peer UNCAC and Greco review evaluation reports as a starting point, the guide helps a broad range of stakeholders draw on the technical findings of the review to design impactful interventions and to coordinate across all the different institutions and stakeholders that are involved and need to be involved in solution generation. So very briefly, from where we sit, the guide really has four important purposes. First, to help governments more swiftly and efficiently take concrete steps necessary to meet our anti-corruption obligations and commitments and come into compliance with accepted international standards. Second, the guide will help make technical information on anti-corruption gaps and needed reforms more easily comprehensible. So civil society, investigative journalists, the public, and frankly, governments can more easily use the information in a pragmatic way. Third, and quite important to us in our bureau at the State Department, considering that we provide a significant amount of funding to this sort of work, our expectation is that the guide is going to help the donor community quickly identify priority areas for technical assistance interventions. And finally, the tool will help peers at the country level hold one another more accountable. Let me just jump down to something that we talked a lot about in the political declaration negotiations, which is the role of civil society, academics, journalists. The declaration being adopted recognizes the importance of raising public awareness around the causes and negative impacts of corruption. The video that Katie showed at the top mentioned this. The declaration notes the important role that civil society, academics, journalists, the private sector, and others play in generating this awareness. The guide outlines processes for translating information about technical gaps into accessible, meaningful summaries that people can use. The guide also provides guidance on finding like-minded partners and building cross-disciplinary coalitions to help find roadmaps to figure out problems. As I mentioned before, our experience has been that these are multifaceted challenges that require stakeholders from across the spectrum, nationally, regionally, and internationally, in order to be effective. So as Chris and Katie both mentioned at the top, we are fortunate in INL to be able to provide funding, both for this guide, but also to support the review mechanism. We have done so since about 2014, or sorry, since 2010. And since then have been able to provide about $4.5 million US to date. We expect to be able to contribute additional funding this year for that. INL also provides support for Greco and the follow-up mechanism for the implementation of the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, as well as the OECD and Istanbul plan-led reviews. While this guide that we're talking about today focuses on UNCAC and the Greco peer review mechanisms, we all on this panel, INL, IFES, CEELI Institute, hope to continue to build on this tool set and provide specialized guidance for our partners working on priority topics or engaging with regional mechanisms. So just in closing, I want to say thank you all so much again to Katie and to Chris and my fellow panelists for the hard work that goes into developing this tool, but the even harder work that comes next in terms of using it, deploying it, and then using the information smartly to push for change, again, from wherever we sit. From our side at the State Department, we really do look forward to continuing to work with you all in the coming years to advance the commitments around the UNGASS political declaration. And I know that the tool is going to be quite useful to us as we move forward in that regard. So thank you all very much. And back to you, Katie.
Thank you so much, Deputy Assistant Secretary. And I was just thinking as you were speaking about partnerships between government and civil society and the important roles of all these different groups, that everyone on this panel has actually been at one time or another in civil society or in government. So I think it's delightful to know that this guide has been influenced and informed by practitioners on both sides. And I know Phil will speak about this shortly. So thank you very much for joining us and for the remarks. One other thing I would say is that we're incredibly lucky not just to have the opportunity to produce such a guide, but also moving forward to have the opportunity to put it into practice ourselves. And I'm sure Chris will agree with me that we are firm believers in taking what we develop and putting it into practice. And as Chris mentioned, beyond the regional program, we have a global anti-corruption program with INL, and we are going to be using this guide in some of the new countries that we're partnering with in Africa, Asia, and Europe in the coming months. So turning now to our authors of the guide, and we are delighted that both authors, as I said earlier, have years, if not decades, of experience with these review mechanisms. And that was very important to us, that it was not someone coming from the outside, but someone who knew very well what the mechanism was like, both from the inside, but also from the outside and on civil society looking to put into practice these peer review reports. So I'm first delighted to introduce Phil Mason, who I think was first introduced to me as the guru of anti-corruption in the United Kingdom, and spent much of his career with the UK government focused on anti-corruption, including as the policy lead for the cross-UK government engagement on anti-corruption. He was the lead for the UK on the UNCAC process. He also has a very strong foot in civil society as part of the member of Transparency International's Advisory Council and many other positions. We were so grateful to have Phil be part of this, developing this tool. And Phil, I'll turn it over to you for you to give us your reflections.
Thank you so much for those very kind words. I've seen the UNCAC process and indeed the Greco process from the inside out. And so I was honoured to be asked to co-author this guide. So thanks so much to all the folks at IFES and CEELI and friends at INL, who I worked with over 20 years with great interest, with folk like Rob Leventhal and John Brandolino, who were instrumental in shaping the UNCAC frame, as well as my very patient and understanding co-author, who's going to speak to us straight afterwards. She's got enormous amount of practical experience on Greco reviews, and I focused on UNCAC. I'm going to organise my thoughts around three aspects, just to say a few words about why we felt a guide like this was needed. Secondly, what it tries to do, and then thirdly, some key changes that I hope the guide will bring about, which will solve some of the barriers that we've identified and give greater impact to peer reviews. Before that, I think we both want to just make very clear, and I think all the folk involved in this exercise want to make clear what this document or what this exercise is not about. It's not a critique of the review mechanisms themselves. I think anybody who's been associated with these processes, whichever one it may be, will have views about how they could be done differently to be better. But we also know how difficult it is. It's a very political process to change the rules of the game. I witnessed the the internal processes in UNCAC, which produced the peer review process for UNCAC. So we know how difficult it is to change those, and we could write a very detailed report, I think, on how things could be improved, but we suspect it wouldn't add very much to the practical realities. So we chose to be very practical and focus on suggestions on how to make the best use of the products that come from the peer review mechanisms as they currently stand. Obviously, we have ambitions and hopes that people will take insights from these, and that may lead to evolving the peer processes in different ways to make life easier for those who want to use them. So first, why do we think a guide like this could be useful? Well, Chris and Katie and Aaron have already intimated some of the issues. For me, I think, having seen from the inside, and I've sat through days and days and hours of being on the receiving end of an UNCAC, or 2 UNCAC reviews, indeed, in the UK, and also been, party to the consultations that go towards those final reports. I know how huge amount of energy, human energy, that goes into these processes. And the experts who spend their days analysing the materials produce comprehensive reviews. The UK one, for example, was over 300 pages long on the first exercise, for example. And I think we all work on these with the expectation that they will be of enormous use to policymakers afterwards. And yet in practice, I think we do see a significant underplaying of the final reports. I think it varies across the agency, the peer reviews. I sense, and I think others sense, that Greco is much more able to use the products, for example, than UNCAC, which is still kind of feeling its way through these processes. The meanings of the reports can be really difficult to grasp for anybody who's not a complete expert in the field. It means that fewer people are making use of them than, in theory, could be making use of them, and benefiting from the insights that they contain. And we are, as Erin mentioned, particularly interested in the potential value of broader constituents of society getting involved, media, academia, civil society, beyond that narrow circle of government legal experts, which we suspect and we see tend to be the parties currently involved. All of those people, all of those parts of society could play a much stronger role in publicising and implementing the messages that a peer review includes. And so currently there is this huge disconnect between, on the one hand, the amount of effort that's going into the reports and the practical impact we see coming out on the ground in real change. And for me, as a policy and a practitioner for 20 years in anti-corruption, for me it feels a huge lost opportunity. So we try and suggest in the document ways to access these reports, make their meanings clearer in very practical ways as the first step. You will have a chance to digest the review, and the short video illustrated the sections that it's broken down into. And I would just say a few words about that. But both Laura and I have had close and personal contact with these processes, and we have broken down what we think needs to happen into a framework of 13 discrete actions to break that task into a manageable set of steps. They revolve around 4 broad themes. One, increasing public awareness of the review process as those exercises are being conducted. Often these are taking place quite under a veil, hence our title. People often don't know they're going on, and it seems to us there are some fairly quick wins in governments being more open about the fact that they're happening. And we give some clues in the report to how civil society members, for example, can find out as best as they can whether these reviews are happening, how they are happening, how they're progressing. There are relatively hidden processes by which you can find out how things are going. So we kind of uncover some of those for readers. Secondly, how to dissect one of these monstrous reports. I mean, they are extraordinarily technical, legal, and if you're not familiar with the areas, they can be really, really off-putting. That's no fault of the authors. The authors of these reports are technical experts, and they've been mandated to do a technical analysis. The fact that it comes out in a way that very few others can understand is the barrier we see, and the purpose for which this tool is trying to help push things forward. The third theme is around how to communicate these very complex and often technically dense issues in ways which resonate with ordinary people and the ordinary lives that they are leading. They know how corruption, or they know that corruption is affecting their abilities for their life chances, and the findings of these reviews can, we think, with good communication, make more people alive to what they're saying, and then hence a feedback loop onto the authorities to make the changes necessary. And then fourthly, how to develop action plans, as Chris said, trying to find a prioritized list of activities that comes out of these reports is a task that just needs some careful consideration. And we've suggested a process by which people can take the whole amount of what a report is saying and put those into a prioritized list. So together, those four types of themes and 13 actions, we think, provide a fairly practical route into turning the analysis that we are given to actual action on the ground. And it can involve a far larger range of parties than currently seem to be interested in these reports. We know from all our experience on tackling corruption that if you are to be successful, it needs to be what you might call an all of society effort. No single actor can play that role in driving things forward. The changes we hope this guide could bring about, I think we've identified three big mindset issues, if you like, that we think this could help shifting for the better. The first is that we would hope that this guide can take the whole processes, the whole set of processes beyond government. Peer reviews at present seem to be rather closed operations confined to government officials, and this guide suggests steps in which we can expand the breadth and the range of people who are going to be engaged. We don't want it to remain a report that sits on a shelf. The second big shift, I think, is the need to go beyond what I call a compliance mindset. Peer reviews can often, particularly because of their legal nature, can often involve simply writing a new law or a better law. And that's important. That's not to diminish the need to constantly improve the formal legal structures and content. But passing a perfect law will have no effect if it's not being implemented. And we see that so much of our attention is on what you might call the formalism of making sure that bodies exist and laws exist, but less perhaps on making sure that they actually have real world value. And of course, it's only in that latter part that these the meaning of legal change really comes about. And the third big shift that I particularly would love to see is the need to go beyond what I think is often a checklist mentality. We can often see peer reviews as checklist events. They are almost like the periodic exam to see how you meet the convention obligations. I think instead there's a strong case to consider peer review reports as one contribution to an ongoing journey that a country is making on anti-corruption. And the guide suggests ways in which these peer reviews can be internalized in the national anti-corruption effort to be ongoing contributions, further bricks in the wall, as it were, rather than a test that is something one kind of gets through, and then once one's got through, one breathes a sigh of relief and kind of gets back to normal. So we think this guide will help shift those sorts of mindsets. It seems to me, having witnessed almost from the word go back in the late 1990s, what the anti-corruption world then was like, that we've never had so much knowledge and understanding about the damage that corruption causes. And we've never had so many good tools that should help us address some of these issues. But we're currently, it seems to me, falling some way behind in making the optimal use of this particular tool. And that's what our guide is attempting to try and recommend. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Phil, so much for your reflections. And as I was listening to you, I was thinking how nice it is that from the start you have joined us in this task and helped us think through what would be particularly practical in this tool, but also that you are a believer in change and that we can always improve, even after several decades working on corruption. And I think that's been a pleasure for us. So I will turn over to your co-author, Laura Stefan, who is the Executive Director of the Expert Forum. And she is also chairperson of the Regional Anti-Corruption Initiative. She's been a Group of States Against Corruption, or GRECO, expert. And as I mentioned before, many of us have been in both government and civil society. And Laura has been a former director in the Romanian Ministry of Justice. When I first met Laura, she was in fact complaining about a particular peer review report that Romania had just received. And we spent the next 2 days talking about what that meant and what could be achieved. So Laura, I'm delighted several years later to be at this point with you and launching this report. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katie. And thank you for the opportunity to be part of this reflection process on how to improve the use of peer review reports. Obviously, it has been a great pleasure for me to work with Phil, whose wisdom on these matters is indeed hard to match, as well as with the partners in the ECAC project, headed by IFES and CEELI and funded by the INL. The concept of the project is intrinsically linked with the discussion we're having today, because we took recommendations made by international bodies in the area of fight against corruption, judicial integrity, and political funding, and we worked with local stakeholders to put them into practice. For all the participating countries, the effort is led by a local NGO, BILI in Bulgaria, TI in Bosnia-Herzegovina, CEMI in Montenegro, and Expert Forum in Romania, operating in close partnership with IFES and CEELI. In a way, the ECAC project has been, avant la lettre, the testing board for the guide from a civil society perspective. So what did we do and what have we noticed? Chris has already explained a bit the process. The first step, of course, was to analyze the reports. We looked not only at the latest ones, but also at the ones issued in the past. And we did that because one of the challenges, as you well know, in the area of anti-corruption is the fragility and the reversibility of reforms. This means that recommendations that were marked in the past as fulfilled may still be relevant today because of measures taken meanwhile to reverse past reforms. We have found that in-depth knowledge about the local environment, political, social, legal, and institutional, is essential in establishing a clear picture of the national anti-corruption landscape. And this is what the local civil society can add to the knowledge that is already contained in these peer review reports. A second step and this was challenging, I must admit, was to distill the recommendations into concrete and actionable objectives, to read between the lines and understand what is truly important. We went on to research the national legal and institutional environment to understand better what is meant by putting those recommendations into practice. Obviously way beyond just adopting a law or a legal amendment, but looking at how that would work in practice and what it would change in our societies. We have reached out to our partners in the project in search of solutions and best practices, and we have reflected upon what could work in the local context. And I cannot emphasize enough how much I believe that solutions have to be tailored to the local context. Having IFES and CEELI by our side meant that we could access immediately their expertise on corruption and transparency of political finance, as well as on judicial integrity. Then, as Chris explained, we've prioritized the recommendations, considering not only their importance, but also their feasibility. We have found that this process is in no way linear, and that within the lifetime of the project, we had to revisit several times the priority list. So why did that happen? Sometimes because political environment changes, new politicians step forward, and they are more inclined into taking actions in particular fields. The societal environment can also play an important role. For example, street protests may offer the needed push for reforms that would otherwise be stuck. Stakeholders may change their mood also, from resistant to reforms in particular fields to having an appetite for action. And I can refer here to electoral authorities or to judicial councils. International negotiation processes such as EU accession, NATO accession to the OECD anti-bribery group can also open windows of opportunity for anti-corruption work. These processes can add leverage to the recommendations, especially when they incorporate them as their own requirements. For example, the EU stresses the importance of compliance with GRECO recommendations during accession negotiations. What we have found in the project is that it is essential to remain flexible and attuned to the local, regional, and international realities and adapt the way of action to them. We have mapped out stakeholders and reflected upon their potential position vis-à-vis the recommendations. Would they support change or would they undermine it? Would they be our partners or likely our adversaries? What triggers them? And how can we access their constituencies, should that be the case? Again, the process is non-linear, and we have discovered that a change in the government can transform a ministry from an adversary to a partner or vice versa. Then we have developed the message for the general public. The effort of putting these often complicated concepts into simple language is very worthwhile. And I believe it is a prerequisite for widening the pro-reform constituency. We spoke out in traditional media, we used social networks. We have explained the commitments that were taken in the framework of peer review processes, and we stressed what they meant in our daily lives. We have underlined the fact that the government has bought into the process and that these reports and recommendations are indeed part of the accepted way to move forward. We have built coalitions with fellow colleagues from the civil society and pro-reform local stakeholders, and we opened communication channels with international partners, such as the Venice Commission, GRECO, the European Commission, the World Bank, the IMF, embassies present in our countries that showed interest in the anti-corruption agenda. And when we have seen slide backs, we have spoken out. We have pushed these topics onto the public agenda, and whenever possible, we have used umbrella processes to mainstream these recommendations. We have argued for their inclusion in national strategic documents, such as strategies and action plan. This approach contributes, as Phil was saying, to changing the perspective from a checklist type of approach to a building block approach, where international commitments are seen as an essential part of the national anti-corruption establishment and are understood and taken forward by national stakeholders. Once included into anti-corruption strategies, we have closely monitored their implementation, and we have worked alongside with national stakeholders to achieve the set objectives. Being able to dip into the knowledge and resources of our partners, of course, strengthened our contribution to this process. In short, we have tested the guide that we now present to you. We hope that others will find it also useful and that it will help bring into the national debate and policies the wealth of knowledge on anti-corruption gathered in these peer review processes. We strongly believe that anti-corruption is not a discussion for a selected and overly specialized group. For reforms to last, they need supporters, and thus they need the people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laura. And something I think you said in your last few comments is very meaningful and has been very clear in this project, is that our local civil society partners have been partners of institutions and not just watchdogs. So they have worked alongside institutions to implement different actions. And I think that's particularly meaningful. We have very little time left, but a lot of excellent questions. So I hope Phil and Laura will indulge me while I just throw out maybe 2 sets of questions for you to briefly answer in these last few minutes. And one of them relates to the availability of information. Obviously, in some countries, these reports, the self-assessments are not available. What can civil society do in this instance? Similarly, some of the recommendations in the guide require access to data that might be hard to find, particularly, for example, in African countries. So what can civil society do about the lack of information? And then secondly, a particularly tough set of questions are around political will. How will the report change this if there's a lack of political will? And particularly with the erosion of democracy globally, there's a lot of shrinking space for civil society. Whereas the report seems to assume that there's room for multi-stakeholder engagement. So how do you address that challenge? Perhaps Phil and then Laura.
Thank you very much. Those are 2 very, very good questions. I think we have implicitly attempted to answer those in the document. The availability issue is one which, to some degree, is a troubling one, given that the vast majority of countries and governments have on multiple occasions expressed their commitment to openness in terms of government. We list in the report a number of examples of where governments have expressed their intentions to be very open about how they conduct government, including numerous resolutions at the UNGASS Conference of States Parties, and we've listed the resolutions there. The African Union has made a declaration in 2015 on the transparency of government. Greco and the Council of Europe have made similar declarations. So our thinking is around getting civil society to hold their governments to the commitments that they themselves have actually made towards transparency. Doubtless the declaration in this coming week will also have text in there which talks about commitments to open government and open transparency of systems. What we've done in the guide is to point to where we know that there is information available, not necessarily on the policy areas, but the UN, for example, publishes the attendees who come to UNGASS to the mechanisms that follow the review process, come to COSP. There are lists of the officials who are coming there. That's a starting point. If civil society knows which official is attending on behalf of the government, one can make efforts to get in contact with those officials. It's not perfect by any means. I think I'm certainly disappointed that under UNGASS, certainly I think in the first round, barely 50% of countries published their full report. To some degree, it's slightly astonishing that a government isn't obligated to publish the full report. Certainly under Greco, we understand that pretty much all these reports are published in full. But we think we've given clues to the ability for folk to start to chip away at that. These are long-term processes, but pointing to where governments themselves have made these commitments seems to be a starting point. On the political will question, I mean, though anybody who's worked in anti-corruption will know that this is as we say in English, an old chestnut in terms of how do you create political will. I've often taken a view that it may not be that one can expect that politicians will suddenly turn around and have this willingness. My view is that organizations like civil society need to change the concept, not so much to have political will, but to make it that politicians politically can't avoid dealing with the issue. And so the more pressure that comes on authorities, the more incentives that are created for governments to address these sorts of issues through the types of processes that we're suggesting here, could change the way in which we think about that elusive sense of political will. I'm not underestimating the problems, particularly the closing space for civil society. That is a dire problem. That is a real challenge. But in many places, we think there are ways in which the external influences on a government can be playing much more to change the way in which those governments think about their political calculations about whether they want to address corruption or not.
Thank you, Phil. And Laura?
Yeah, so I think the essence is that you have to make it a question that is relevant for many. And you have to understand what triggers certain reactions from our stakeholders, right? I mean, politicians don't do it out of the goodness of their heart. They do it because it matters for the people that vote for them. They do it because they cannot avoid it. They do it because we've done it for many years like this. So I think it is important to be able to digest these messages in the peer review reports into a language that is understandable by people, and not by 5 people in the Ministry of Justice, but by millions around the country. And I think with the shrinking space for NGOs, that is a very serious problem. And I think the fact that the space is shrinking makes it even more urgent for us to start putting our act together better. And go out there and talk to the people about the things that we consider important. Now, the availability of information in the case of Greco is less of a concern. There are very few countries that don't publish their report. And I think the Greco example is interesting in seeing how peer pressure works among the countries that are members of the group. Because it's a bit embarrassing when you don't give your approval for publication immediately in the plenary or immediately after. So once you open this door, I think peer pressure between governments would also work in making the information more transparent. But indeed, if you don't have the reports, it's kind of challenging to explore the details included in the reports.
Thank you, Laura. And in the last couple of minutes, I'd like to just open the floor to Christopher and then Deputy Assistant Secretary Barclay for any responses to those questions or just any final thoughts. Chris?
Unmute myself. Nothing, it's been fascinating to follow the discussion, and I just want to applaud the work again by Laura and Phil. And we look forward to putting this to use. I do think in the ECAC project, we had the low-hanging fruit, because I do think the ECAC, the Greco reports, as Laura's referenced, they're more accessible and they're more applicable here. FATF might be the other area where this could really be done. But as we're finding, as we move to other regions, Asia and Africa, it's a little more challenging to find peer review reports that are going to be available and easily applicable. So.
Thank you, Chris. And yes.
You know, I just want to join Chris in thanking you guys for this. I read through all the questions, very good, thoughtful questions there. So thank you to the panelists for raising those issues, both, as Laura mentioned, closing space for civil society, holding governments accountable to producing the whole report. What do you do when you can only get 20 pages? These are all things, I appreciate hearing these things, because these are the sorts of things I take back and then we work into our conversations with counterparts in other countries to do what we're talking about here, sort of at the diplomatic level. My only substantive comment about the conversation about political will is to remember there are windows of political will that can often be fleeting. And I think we, both from inside and outside the government, need to see those moments as real opportunities where progress can actually happen more quickly than we sometimes expect it can. I've seen that happen across a range of issues I've had the opportunity to work on during my career, not just anti-corruption. And so I would encourage us all to see where those windows are and be ready to jump into a space that may not be open forever. Because the change can happen more quickly, I think, than sometimes we can expect. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you, Katie and Chris, very much again, and Phil and Laura, thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Deputy Assistant Secretary. And I think Laura would agree with me that the support from INL for this program exactly allows that kind of rapid response and adjustment of activities. And as Laura said in her remarks, she was able to change course quickly depending on a window of opportunity that opened. So I think the type of support is particularly important as well. I would just like to close by referencing something that the Deputy Assistant Secretary mentioned in her comments, which is the potential phase 2 of it or expansion of this tool. And as Chris said, some of the mechanisms in Africa and Asia, Latin America are different again. In our broader global impacts project, we have the opportunity to start testing out this tool, but also expanding it to consider these other peer review mechanisms. So I would hope perhaps in the coming year, we might convene this panel again and address some lessons that we've learned in applying the tool and perhaps the expansion. But in the meantime, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. Please go to our website and feel free to download the tool. And we look forward to hearing about the use of the tool globally. Thank you.
Thank you.